Mark Sullivan wiped the sweat from his brow as he dug through the cluttered attic of his suburban Chicago home. At 38, even with the long hours as a high school history teacher, he still had enough energy to tackle weekend tasks like sorting through this forgotten space. "What's this?" he muttered, pulling a worn leather album from behind a stack of dusty magazines. Settling down on an old trunk, Mark flipped open the album, a wave of nostalgia washing over him as he leafed through photos of his Irish-American family. His gaze lingered on a recent family picture. Anna's growing up so fast, he thought, studying his 13-year-old daughter's features. Something in her face sparked a curiosity he couldn't quite place. Turning to an old photo of himself at that age, he noticed some subtle, yet unmistakable, differences. Anna's nose had a slight curve, and while her eyes were the same blue as his, they held a distinct almond shape he couldn't place within his family tree. Mark then looked at a photo of 11-year-old Alex, noticing the boy's complexion was a shade darker, his hair a richer brown than his own. "It's probably nothing," he reassured himself, though he couldn't completely silence the unease creeping in. Yet as he kept studying the photos, a seed of doubt began to grow. Later that evening, after the kids were asleep, Mark found himself huddled over his laptop in the dimly lit study. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he finally typed, "DNA test kits." "What are you up to, hon?" Rebecca's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, a curious look on her face. Mark quickly closed the laptop, an awkward pang of guilt hitting him. "Just researching for class," he fibbed, feeling the words catch in his throat. "Heading to bed soon?" Rebecca nodded, satisfied. "Don't stay up too late, love." As she wandered off, he reopened the laptop and completed the order for 3 DNA kits. His heart thudded as he hit confirm purchase, wondering what kind of truth he was digging up. The next few weeks were agonizing as Mark waited for the DNA results. Every morning at breakfast, he found himself scrutinizing his children's features, searching for any resemblance to himself or Rebecca. Then, one day, the email finally arrived. With trembling hands, he opened the attachment. His own results were as expected, a mix of Irish and other European ancestry. But Anna and Alex's results hit him like a punch to the gut. Both children showed a significant amount of Mexican heritage. "This can't be real," he whispered, staring at the screen, his mind numb with disbelief. That night, after hours of restless tossing, Mark made a decision. He would hire a private investigator to get to the bottom of this. The next day, he met with a PI named Hank in a nondescript coffee shop. "So, what are we looking into here?" Hank asked, his face as unreadable as stone. Mark leaned in, voice lowered, "I need to know if my wife has been unfaithful, and with whom." Hank nodded, jotting notes. "Do you have any suspects?" Mark shook his head. "No idea, but my kids, they might not be mine." 2 weeks later, Hank called with an update. "Mr. Sullivan, I think you need to come to my office. There's something you should see." Mark's heart dropped as he glanced at the photos spread across Hank's desk. There, clear as day, was his wife Rebecca, wrapped in the embrace of another man, a man whose features echoed in Anna and Alex's faces. "His name is Carlos Martinez," Hank explained. "He's Rebecca's boss at the construction company. They've been involved for at least 15 years, well before you two were married." The room spun around Mark. 15 years? But we've only been married for. Hank nodded, a hint of sympathy in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan. There's more." He handed Mark a stack of evidence, love letters, emails, hotel receipts. The affair had been ongoing, and undeniably passionate. As Mark sifted through the pieces, his world shattered. Every loving moment, every family memory was now tainted by this betrayal. Who is he?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible. "Carlos Martinez," Hank said, "a notable figure in local construction, known for his philanthropic work and his Mexican heritage." It all clicked, a sickening realization tightening in Mark's gut as he gazed at the man's photo, seeing his children's faces reflected in it. My whole life, he murmured, more to himself than to Hank, has been a lie. Mark knew he couldn't handle this alone. Seeking comfort, he gathered his family that Sunday afternoon, meeting at his parents' home with the familiar warmth of his mother's apple pie baking in the oven. But as he started to share his story, the photo, the DNA test, the investigator's findings, he noticed an uncomfortable silence blanketing the room. His mother wouldn't meet his gaze, his father looked down, shifting uneasily. His sister Beth exchanged a furtive look with their brother, Sam. "What is it?" Mark demanded, dread creeping up his spine. "What aren't you telling me?" Beth finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mark, we knew." The word struck him like a physical blow. "You knew?" He felt the shock ripple through him. "What do you mean, you knew?" His father cleared his throat. "Son, we found out about Rebecca's affair a few years ago. We thought," he trailed off. "We thought it was best not to tell you." Mark's voice rose, a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Best not to tell me? You let me live in this lie? Let me raise kids that aren't mine, thinking they were?" His mother reached for his hand. "We only wanted to protect you, dear. You seemed so happy." Mark recoiled, disgusted. "Happy? I was blind, ignorant. How could you all keep this from me?" Sam broke the silence, defensive. "We didn't want to hurt you, bro. We thought what you didn't know wouldn't hurt you." Mark laughed bitterly, gesturing to his shattered self. "Look at me now. Tell me this doesn't hurt." He stood, unable to bear the sight of them, the very people he trusted most, now betrayers just as deeply as Rebecca. "Mark, please," his mother called after him. "We can talk about this, help you through it," but Mark was already heading for the door. "I don't need your help," Mark spat, voice cold with anger. "I don't need any of you." He stormed out of the house into the dimming light of late afternoon, feeling more alone than he ever had. His wife, his children, even his own family, everything he had believed and felt like it had been woven out of lies. In that crushing moment of isolation, a hard, unbreakable resolve began to settle within him. He knew now that he couldn't trust anyone he had once held dear. The only person he could rely on was himself. Driving home, his mind whirled with the weight of the betrayals he'd uncovered. Mark made a decision: he would take matters into his own hands and make those responsible pay. As the sun set, Mark Sullivan's old life faded with it, along with the last traces of the trusting man he once was. In his place was someone transformed by betrayal, determined to reclaim control over his own fate. The following morning, Mark sat alone in his classroom, staring at the empty desks before him, the weight of his discoveries pressing on him like a physical burden. He hadn't slept in weeks, his mind consumed by the betrayals that had come to light. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts, and Principal Lawrence stood in the doorway, his expression serious. "Got a minute, Mark?" he asked, though it was clear he wasn't really asking. Mark nodded, motioning to an empty student desk. Lawrence sat down, the chair creaking under his weight. "There's no easy way to say this," Lawrence began. "But the school board is pushing through a new history curriculum. It's not good." Mark's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, not good?" Lawrence sighed, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "See for yourself." Mark flipped through the documents, his frown deepening with every page. The proposed changes were worse than not good, they were an outright whitewashing of history. "This is," Mark trailed off, catching himself before he let his true thoughts slip. "Sorry, I mean, this is disappointing." Lawrence nodded. "You're right, it's worse than disappointing. But the board's under pressure from some big donors. They're pushing this through whether we like it or not." Mark felt a familiar anger flare in his chest, the same anger that had simmered since he discovered the truth about his family. But this time, he realized, it was something he could fight. "We can't let this happen," he said, his voice low and resolute. Lawrence looked at him, skeptical but intrigued. "I hear you, Mark, but my hands are tied." "The board, forget the board," Mark interrupted. "These kids deserve better, they deserve the truth." Lawrence looked like he was about to argue, but then he slumped in defeat. "You're right, but what can we do?" Mark stood, pacing the room. In the fog of personal turmoil, a new clarity was emerging. "We organize. Teachers, parents, students, we make our voices heard." As he spoke, a plan took shape in his mind. This was more than just a protest against curriculum changes. It was a way to channel his pent-up anger and frustration into something meaningful. Over the next few weeks, Mark poured himself into the fight, organizing meetings, drafting petitions, and rallying support from every corner of the school community. One evening, as he was putting the finishing touches on a presentation for the next board meeting, his daughter, Anna, peeked into his home office. "Dad," she said, hesitantly. "Can I talk to you?" Mark looked up, guilt washing over him. He had been so absorbed in this new battle that he had hardly spoken to his kids. "Of course, sweetheart. What's up?" Anna perched on the edge of his desk, swinging her feet nervously. "Is everything okay? You've been different lately." Mark's heart clenched. He wanted to tell her everything, about the lies, her real father, the hurt. But looking into her innocent, concerned face, he couldn't bear to shatter her world. "I'm sorry, Anna," he said softly. "There's just a lot going on at school, but I promise, everything's going to be okay." Anna nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. "Is that why Mom's been crying at night?" The question hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He had been so consumed by his own pain and his fight at school that he hadn't even noticed Rebecca's distress. I didn't know she was crying," he admitted. Anna shrugged. "She tries to hide it, but I hear her sometimes." Mark pulled his daughter into a hug, his mind racing. He realized he'd been losing himself in this external battle, almost as a way to run from his personal pain. "I'll talk to her," he promised Anna, "and I'm sorry I've been so distracted. How about we have a family game night tomorrow?" Anna's face brightened. "Really? Can we play Monopoly?" Mark chuckled, the sound feeling foreign to his ears. "Sure, Monopoly it is, kiddo." As Anna skipped out of the room, Mark turned back to his computer, his focus split. The fight against the curriculum changes was important, but so was his family, even if it wasn't what he'd once believed. He would have to find a way to balance both, and somehow, make a decision about what to do with the truth he now carried. As weeks went on, Mark found himself living a double life. By day, he was the passionate teacher, rallying support to oppose the curriculum changes. By night, he was a man consumed with thoughts of revenge. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, he sat in his study, surrounded by financial records and legal documents. Hank, the investigator, had provided more than just evidence of Rebecca's affair. He'd uncovered suspicious financial dealings at Carlos's construction company. Potential tax fraud, in fact, that could bring down the entire operation. Mark's fingers hovered over his keyboard. With just a few clicks, he could send an anonymous tip to the IRS. It would set off a chain reaction that could destroy Carlos's life. But did he really want that? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Rebecca stood in the doorway, her face lined with worry. "Mark, can we talk?" He nodded, quickly minimizing his computer screen as Rebecca walked in, her eyes red from crying. "I'm worried about you," she said softly. "You've been so distant lately. Is it something I did?" Mark felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat, but he swallowed it. If only she knew. "No," he lied, the word leaving a bitter taste. "It's just this thing with the school board. It's taking up a lot of my time." Rebecca nodded, though it was clear she didn't entirely believe him. "I miss you," she whispered, reaching out to touch his hand. For a moment, Mark nearly gave in, nearly confessed everything he knew and everything he felt. But then he remembered the photos, the love letters, and the 15 years of lies. He pulled his hand back. "I'm sorry," he said, avoiding her gaze. I need some time," Mark muttered, his voice tight. Rebecca's face fell, but she nodded and quietly left the room. Once she was gone, Mark turned back to his computer. The following day, he found himself in the office of a divorce attorney, a man notorious for his aggressive tactics and high success rate. "So, Mr. Sullivan," the attorney began, reclining in his plush leather chair, "what exactly are we dealing with here?" Mark took a deep breath and laid out the sordid details, the affair, the paternity questions, and even the betrayal by his own family. The attorney's eyes gleamed with predatory interest. "This is good," he said, rubbing his hands together. "We're going to take her for everything she's got." But Mark shook his head. "No," he replied firmly. "I don't want to hurt the kids. I just want justice." The attorney nodded, though Mark could see the disappointment in his eyes. "All right, we'll do it your way," he said, though his tone hinted at doubt. But in cases like this, striking hard and fast is usually the way to go. As Mark left the office, he felt both relief and apprehension. There was no going back now. Over the next few weeks, he methodically put his plan into action. Quietly, he liquidated joint assets, moving funds into accounts solely under his name. He gathered every piece of evidence Hank, the private investigator, had uncovered, building a solid case against Rebecca and Carlos. Then, late one night, when he was certain Rebecca was asleep, he made the call to the IRS. His voice shook as he reported the tax fraud at Carlos's company, but he forced himself to see it through. As he hung up, Mark felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him was exhilarated to finally be taking action after weeks of feeling helpless, but another part of him felt hollow, wondering if this path of revenge would truly bring him any peace. He pushed his doubts aside, he'd come too far to turn back now. The night of Carlos's company gala arrived, and Mark stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. Rebecca appeared behind him, radiant in a shimmering evening gown. "You look handsome," she said, meeting his gaze in the mirror. Mark forced a smile. "Thanks. You look beautiful." For a moment, he almost faltered. The woman in the mirror was the same one he had once fallen deeply in love with. But then, the memories of betrayal returned, hardening his resolve. The gala was held in an opulent ballroom, with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over Chicago's construction elite. Mark watched as Rebecca moved through the room, laughing and mingling with ease, playing the perfect corporate wife. And then, he saw him, Carlos Martinez, resplendent in a tailored tuxedo, holding court near the bar. Mark's fists clenched involuntarily. This was the man who had fathered his children, the man who had been involved with his wife for 15 years. As the evening wore on, Mark bided his time, making small talk and nursing a single glass of whiskey as he waited for the right moment. Finally, Carlos took to the podium, his voice booming confidently. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I'm thrilled to announce that this has been our most successful year yet. The future of Martinez Construction has never looked brighter." The crowd burst into applause. Mark seized his chance, rising from his seat and striding toward the podium with purpose. He could feel Rebecca's eyes on him, her face a mask of confusion and alarm. "Excuse me," Mark said, his voice slicing through the applause. "I have something to add." Carlos's smile faltered for a second before he composed himself. "Of course, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Sullivan, husband of our esteemed HR director, Rebecca." Mark took the microphone, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. "Thank you, Carlos," he began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I just wanted to congratulate you on your success. It's truly remarkable what you've built here." He paused, scanning the crowd, his eyes landing on Rebecca, who was pale and motionless. "But I think it's time we're all honest about the foundation this company is built on." Mark reached into his jacket, pulling out a folder. "I have here the results of DNA tests that prove Carlos Martinez is the biological father of my children. I also have evidence of a 15-year affair between Mr. Martinez and my wife, Rebecca." Gasps and whispers erupted throughout the room. Carlos's face went ashen, his knuckles white as he gripped the podium. "And that's not all," Mark continued, his voice rising above the din. "I also have documents detailing years of tax fraud and embezzlement at Martinez Construction, which are now in the hands of the IRS and the FBI." The room exploded into chaos. Board members leaped to their feet, shouting questions. Investors made for the exits, and in the center of it all stood Carlos and Rebecca, their carefully constructed world crumbling before them. Mark watched as the company owner, his face flushed with anger, stormed over to Carlos. "You're fired," he bellowed. "And you'd better believe we'll cooperate fully with any investigation." Rebecca stumbled toward Mark, tears streaming down her face. "Mark," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "How could you do this?" Mark looked at her, feeling a strange combination of satisfaction and sorrow. "How could I?" he replied quietly. "How could you, Rebecca? 15 years of lies. Our whole marriage, a sham." As security began ushering people out, Mark turned on his heel and walked away. Behind him, he could hear Rebecca's desperate sobs and Carlos's attempts to appease the furious board members. But he didn't look back. Outside, the cool night air slapped him in the face. He loosened his tie, taking deep, steadying breaths. It was done, his revenge was complete. But as he watched the chaos unfold through the ballroom windows, he felt no joy, no triumph, only a hollow emptiness where his anger had once burned. He hailed a cab and gave the driver his home address. As the city lights blurred past, Mark wondered what would come next. He had torn down the facade of his life, now he had to figure out how to rebuild something genuine from the ruins. The morning after the gala, Mark Sullivan woke to a world forever altered. The taste of victory was bitter, mingling with the sourness of lingering betrayal and unresolved anger. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the emptiness in his chest would ever go away. His phone buzzed repeatedly. News of the previous night's confrontation had spread like wildfire through Chicago's business and social circles. Ignoring the flood of messages, Mark focused on the next step in his meticulously planned path to closure. At exactly 9 a.m., Mark walked into the offices of Keller and Collins, a law firm housing one of Chicago's most feared divorce attorneys, Richard Keller. Known as a shark in a sea of minnows, Keller had a reputation for leaving his clients' opponents with little more than the clothes on their backs. His office was a testament to his success: polished mahogany, plush leather chairs, and a view of Lake Michigan that likely cost more per square foot than most people's homes. "Mr. Sullivan," Hayes greeted him, rising to shake his hand, his eyes glinting with the look of a predator. "I heard about last night's performance. Quite the show, I must say." Richard Keller leaned back in his leather chair, eyes glinting with satisfaction as Mark settled into the seat across from him. Mark placed a thick folder on the desk. "I want this done quickly and cleanly, Mr. Keller. I have all the evidence you'll need right here." Keller's eyes lit up as he flipped through the documents. "Oh, this is good, very good. With this, we can," Mark interrupted him, his tone resolute. "No. I don't want to destroy her completely. I just want what's fair, and I want the kids." Keller's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, but he nodded. "Of course, Mr. Sullivan. We'll proceed as you wish." In the weeks that followed, Mark's life became a whirlwind of legal meetings and court appearances. Cornered by the overwhelming evidence against her, Rebecca put up little resistance. Her once pristine appearance gave way to dark circles and a permanent look of defeat. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Mark was granted full custody of Anna and Alex, along with the majority of the family's assets. Rebecca was left with minimal alimony and limited visitation rights, a hollow prize in the shadow of her losses. As Mark exited the courthouse, he spotted Rebecca slumped on a bench, her head in her hands. For a brief moment, he felt a pang of something, pity, perhaps, or regret. But he quickly reminded himself of the years of deception and betrayal that had gutted his life, and he walked away without a backward glance. Meanwhile, across town, Carlos Martinez faced his own personal descent. The IRS investigation, triggered by Mark's anonymous tip, had uncovered years of tax fraud and embezzlement. Carlos's sterling reputation in the construction industry lay in tatters. Desperate to salvage his lifestyle, he turned to gambling. At first, he stuck to legitimate casinos, but as his losses mounted, he spiraled into the darker side of Chicago's gambling scene. One night, in a smoke-filled back room of a rundown bar, Carlos sat at a poker table, a sheen of sweat on his brow. Down to his last chip, he had already lost his savings, his home, and any chance of rebuilding his career. All in, he rasped, pushing his final chip forward. The dealer, a man with dead eyes and nicotine-stained fingers, dealt the last card. Carlos's hand shook as he turned it over. "House wins," the dealer announced with a flat tone. Carlos stumbled out into the cold Chicago night, a broken man. In mere months, he had fallen from one of Chicago's most respected businessmen to a destitute gambler with a mountain of debt. And somewhere across the city, Mark Sullivan slept soundly for the first time in months, his revenge complete. A "for sale" sign stood starkly on the manicured lawn of the Sullivan family home. Mark watched from the driveway as the realtor hammered it into place, each strike another nail in the coffin of his old life. "Dad?" Anna's voice broke his reverie. "Are we really leaving?" Mark turned to his daughter, seeing the mix of uncertainty and hope in her eyes. At 13, Anna was old enough to understand the broad strokes of what had happened, even if she didn't know all the sordid details. "Yes, sweetheart, we are," he said, pulling her into a hug. "It's time for a fresh start." Alex burst out of the house, his 11-year-old energy seemingly untouched by the recent turmoil. "I call shotgun in the moving truck," he shouted, racing toward the driveway. Mark couldn't help but smile. Despite everything, the lies, the betrayal, the public fallout of the divorce, his kids had shown a resilience that left him in awe. They'd chosen to stay with him, recognizing his steadfast love and support, even in the wake of the shocking truth about their biological father. The move was more than a change of scenery, it was a chance to rebuild, to create a life free from the weight of past deception. Mark had accepted a position as principal at Sage Academy, a respected private school known for its progressive approach to history education. As they drove away from their former home, he caught glimpses of neighbors peeking from behind their curtains, no doubt relieved to see the Sullivans leave, a final chapter to the neighborhood's whispered scandals. The drive to their new town was a mixture of excited chatter from the kids and long stretches of contemplative silence from Mark. His thoughts drifted to the curriculum battle that had consumed him during his personal crisis. His victory in that fight had earned him respect within educational circles, opening doors he hadn't anticipated. As they crossed state lines, leaving Chicago's skyline behind, Mark felt the weight of his anger begin to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of optimism. Their new home was smaller, but its large windows filled it with light, and each room seemed to hold the promise of a fresh start. Anna and Alex raced through the house, claiming bedrooms and squabbling over closet space, while Mark stood in the empty living room, taking it all in. The first few weeks in their new town flew by in a blur of unpacking, school preparations, and community introductions. Mark dove into his new role at Sage Academy, determined to make a lasting impact on his students' lives. During this time, he came to realize that moving on required more than a change of scenery, it required healing. The betrayal he'd endured had left deep scars, scars that would only fade with conscious effort. On impulse, he decided to start a support group for people who had experienced betrayal by their spouses. The first meeting was held in a small room at the community center, with just 3 attendees besides himself. Mark began, his voice a little shaky. "My name is Mark," he said, "and I'm here because my wife of 15 years had an affair with her boss, an affair that resulted in 2 children. I thought they were mine," Mark confessed, feeling an unexpected weight lift from his chest. Simply sharing his story, speaking his truth to others who understood, was cathartic in a way he hadn't anticipated. Week by week, the group grew, bringing together people from all walks of life, united by the common thread of betrayal. They found solace and strength in each other's stories. In helping others navigate the turbulent waters of broken trust, Mark discovered a new sense of purpose. It was at one of these meetings that Mark first met Danielle. She sat quietly at the back of the room, her dark hair framing a face that showed both strength and vulnerability. When she finally spoke, her story of betrayal and resilience resonated deeply with him. After the meeting, they lingered, conversation flowing effortlessly between them. Danielle, it turned out, was also an educator, a history teacher at a nearby high school. "I've heard great things about what you're doing at Sage Academy," she said, a spark of admiration in her eyes. "Your approach to teaching history is inspiring." Mark felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Thank you," he replied, genuinely touched. "It's been a challenge, but a rewarding one." As the weeks turned to months, their friendship deepened. They challenged each other intellectually, sharing ideas about education and life, and she inspired him to push boundaries and think beyond conventional teaching methods. One evening, as they walked through a local park after a passionate discussion on the role of education and social justice, Mark realized something had changed. The hollow feeling he'd carried in his chest for so long had been replaced by something hopeful. He looked at Danielle, and she returned his gaze with the same realization mirrored in her eyes. Slowly, cautiously, they leaned toward each other, sharing a gentle, tentative kiss, a promise of something genuine and honest. I'm not sure I'm ready for this," he admitted. Danielle squeezed his hand and said softly, "That's okay. We've got time." And for the first time in years, Mark Sullivan looked toward the future with real hope. For years passed in a blur of school events, family dinners, and quiet evenings with Danielle. Mark's life had settled into a rhythm he hadn't thought possible after his divorce. Anna, now 17, was thriving in her junior year of high school, while Alex, 15, had become captain of his school's debate team. His quick wit and passion for justice filled Mark with pride. One crisp autumn morning, Mark was in his office at Sage Academy, reviewing applications for a new history teacher position when his phone buzzed. The number was familiar, yet he hesitated before answering. "Hello. Mark, it's Rachel. Rebecca's sister." Mark felt his stomach drop. He hadn't heard from anyone in Rebecca's family since the divorce. "Rachel, what's wrong?" There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. "It's Rebecca. She's gone, Mark. She passed away last night." The world tilted as he gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. "What happened?" Rachel's voice broke. It was her heart, an undiagnosed condition. She went in her sleep. As she filled him in on funeral arrangements and other details, Mark found himself oddly detached. He felt no joy in Rebecca's death, but neither did he feel the crushing sorrow he might have expected. It was as if he was hearing about the passing of a distant acquaintance, not the woman he'd once vowed to love for a lifetime. But then Rachel's tone changed. "Mark, there's something else you should know," she said, her voice tinged with sadness and guilt. "Rebecca, she struggled after the divorce, after everything with Carlos. She couldn't find work in her field. You know, the scandal." Mark listened, stunned, as Rachel described Rebecca's last years. Unable to secure a job in human resources or any corporate setting, she had been working as a janitor at a community college, barely making ends meet, living in a small, run-down apartment. "And Carlos?" Mark asked, though he wasn't sure why he cared. Rachel's bitter laugh crackled through the phone. "That bastard fled to Mexico a year ago. Gambling debts, from what I heard. Left Rebecca to fend for herself. As the call ended, Mark sat in silence, the weight of the past pressing in on him. The life he had rebuilt over the last 4 years suddenly felt fragile, as if his past could reach out and shatter it at any moment. That evening, he gathered Anna and Alex in the living room, with Danielle by his side, a steady support. "Kids," Mark began, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I have some news about your mother." He watched their faces closely as he shared the information, ready to offer comfort as needed. Both his children, now young adults, received the news with a maturity that both surprised and saddened him. "Do you think we should go to the funeral?" Anna asked softly. Mark looked at his daughter, seeing echoes of Rebecca in her features. "I think that's something we need to decide together. It's okay if you want to go, and it's also okay if you don't." After a long discussion filled with quiet reflection and shared memories, they decided, as a family, to attend the funeral, not out of obligation, but as a final chapter in a story that had shaped them all. The day of the funeral was overcast and cool. Mark stood between Anna and Alex at the graveside, their hands clasped in his as the priest intoned the final prayers. Mark's mind drifted, reflecting on the winding path that had led him to this moment. Yes, his revenge had brought a form of justice, but as he stood there, watching his children say goodbye to a mother they barely knew, he realized that revenge had not brought him happiness. That had come later, through resilience, dedication to his children, and a commitment to live by his values. As they turned to leave, Mark squeezed his children's hands, truly seeing them for the first time in this new light, and feeling a wave of gratitude for the life they had built, one free from lies and betrayal, founded on honesty and unconditional love. They walked toward the parking lot, where Danielle waited by the car, a reminder of the new life they had forged, based on trust, integrity, and the strength of chosen family. As they drove away from the cemetery, leaving behind the last physical tie to their old life, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but he no longer feared the journey. He had his children, he had Danielle, and he had a life built on truth. The ghosts of his past would always be there, lingering in the shadows of memory, but they no longer held power over him. Mark Sullivan had faced his demons, weathered the storm of betrayal, and come out stronger. As the car merged onto the highway, heading home, he looked in the rearview mirror at Anna and Alex. They were chatting quietly, their heads close together, and in that moment, Mark knew with absolute certainty that despite all the pain and hardship, he wouldn't change a thing. Those trials had forged a new family, one bound not by blood or false promises, but by choice, love, and a shared commitment to honesty. The future lay open before them, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with new memories, new triumphs, and new love. And for the first time in a long time, Mark Sullivan felt truly, deeply happy.
What do you think about this story? Write in comments. If you don't follow our channel Cheating Room, you will probably never hear from us again. If you are subscribed, congratulations, you will not miss any exciting story. Thank you for listening to this shocking story with us. See you again.